Yes, my life was changed about 10 years ago. Prior to that, I had built shopping centers, and I had started a pharmaceutical company, and I had been in the oil and gas business, and I enjoyed those things, but quite frankly, not as much as the work that I'm doing now. 9/11 happened. Eldest daughter was traumatized. We were all traumatized. I reflected back to the Marshall Plan. I don't know if people in this audience are familiar or old enough or are familiar with the Marshall Plan. And our country, my country, was smart enough to reach out to their enemies and come up with a plan to enable them to participate in the modern economy. And therefore, you have NATO, and you have friends, and you have alliances, and you have a system that I think works long term. And so my belief was that if these individuals could have opportunity, the world would change. And that belief was predicated upon time that I had spent in Ireland. I had spent a fair amount of time there around 1999 and 2000. And I saw that when people had opportunity, all the killing and all the animosity changed. And the joke there was that people that were working towards killing each other were then working to make a living together. And the difference was just palpable. And in 2 or 3 years, which is really a nanosecond in terms of history time, the attitudes changed radically. When I first went there, if you worked with one religious faction, you couldn't work with the other. They were very clear and very adamant about it. And then, poof, by 2003, they literally were making a killing together, as they joked about it. And so my feeling as a result of looking at 9/11 was to say, okay, what can we do to go into the region to give these youth the opportunity that I had? And quite frankly, I think of myself as a beneficiary of the geographical lottery. I grew up in a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a runner, but now I'm a recreational runner. When I was younger and I was a runner, it wasn't for recreation, it was for survival. It was a little different circumstances in those years. And so, but I had the opportunity. I was able to get student loans and then scholarships to grad school, and with a little bit of work and a little bit of imagination, I was able to create companies that filled niche and made money for my staff and for myself. And life seemed very simple that way, and I thought that's what I would do until I retired. But then 9/11 happened and the world changed. I was very fortunate. I had been through my real estate development, knew some fairly smart politicians, and I leaned on them to find intelligent people in Washington to help me come to grips with this situation. And found people from Congress, people from the Council on Foreign Relations, diplomats. I had one very passionate man. His name is Mokhtar Lamani. Mokhtar was the ambassador to the United Nations for the OIC, Organization of Islamic Council. And when I told him I wanted to do, he looked at me in the beginning, and quite frankly, I think he thought I was nuts. And when I told him I was Jewish, he was sure I was nuts. But for whatever reason, it took. And the next thing I know, he and I got on a plane, and we traveled all over through the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey. We stayed in Afghanistan. We visited Lektar Brahimi, who was the UN representative running the mission there. And I remember I got there, and I was naive. I didn't really understand it. And Lektar went up to my room for whatever reason to watch me unpack. And I'm taking my running clothes out and my sneakers. And he said, "You're a runner." And he said, "How fast do you think you can run?" I didn't do any running there. And so we continued to go around the region. I hired the Brookings Institution in Washington, and they were very helpful. And we wanted to figure out what we could do that could really have impact. It could really make a difference without the billions of dollars. I committed $10 million to launch it, and quite frankly, that was a drop in the bucket. I'm happy to say that this year's funding for the foundation is excess of that from other people that are throwing their lot in with us. So we needed to figure out what we could do that could have disproportionate leverage to the effort that we put in. And so we looked around and we learned very simply that in the region, the skills that people were learning were not the skills that were needed in the labor force. It's very sad, very true. There's a tremendous amount of rote learning. Rote learning is quite frankly somewhat useless in this mechanized age. You can get a computer that can memorize anything better than we can. But they didn't learn how to think critically, how to think imaginatively, how to think out of the box. And so we made a couple of decisions that were critical. One is that we decided that any training that we would do would have to be linked directly to a job. Nobody had done that. It just seemed astounding that, it's not exactly brilliant, but it was a good way to go forward. And that we would shoot as a mantra for 85% of our graduates to be placed in employment. By the way, we didn't start off that way. We weren't that smart. We started off by having 100% of our graduates being placed in jobs. That didn't work at all. I remember the first graduating class, people had a sense of entitlement. 100% of them were getting jobs. They didn't have to do much. They could wait for the right job. And so we backed off on that, and we created some competitive environment where only 85%, and so we always knew that 15% were going to fail. And we have systems where our students fail themselves. If you don't show up, you lose points. If you don't do your homework, you lose more points. We also created a system where we were not going to be the Americans that had all the answers, that were going to come into town as the experts and say, we have all your problems under control here and we can fix them. And we didn't do that. We took a little more humble approach. And by the way, these were not my ideas. These were ideas of people a lot smarter than I am who joined the organization. We have over 100 employees now, and so I'm a small part of what we do. I get to be the spokesman and come to wonderful places and get to speak. The heavy lifting now is done by others. But we made a decision to create standalone foundations. Foundations that would be locally run, locally operated, where the board of directors and the staff would all be indigenous, the teachers would all be local, and the decisions would be local. And it scared a lot of people when we discussed it. But nevertheless, we felt if we were going to have success, if we were going to create a foundation that had the ability of having long-term impact, we needed to do that. I was fortunate when the foundation was just getting off the ground. I tapped a guy on the shoulder by the name of Michael Hager. Michael was one of those dear people who was a Harvard undergrad, Harvard lawyer, probably could have gone off and made a lot of money, and chose not to. He founded an organization called IDLO, which trains lawyers to represent their companies, their countries, a not-for-profit. He worked for USAID, and he was in his, the time I hired him, he was in his mid-60s. Not a normal decision for somebody starting a new foundation, but he had run 21 marathons and was very enthusiastic and very young. And so he was my original guide and mentor to getting these off the ground, because he knew what needed to be done in the region, having lived in the region. So we went into the region and we started looking around to build local boards. And at the beginning, obviously, we had no credibility. You know, here was a guy who worked for USAID and another guy who was a Jewish shopping center builder from the US with some ideas, not exactly the team that you'd think would have success. But little by little, we built a following in the US. We built a board of directors of very powerful people that had credibility. We brought on to the team, for instance, a guy by the name of Samar Khoury. Samar is the head of the largest construction company in the Middle East. He's Palestinian. He's a very strong supporter and advocate for what we do. We brought on board a gentleman by the name of Moeen Qureshi. He was the Prime Minister of Pakistan. We created a strategic relationship with Intel, with Cisco. Manpower has become a strong partner. David Arkless, who runs their international division, has provided a huge amount of curriculum and funding and operational support. So with these key partners, we've been able to go into the region and have credibility, build local boards, and make a difference. I'm going to kind of walk through some of the countries. I have a little device here that I'm told works, and we'll try it. Okay, good. By the way, we're going to kind of walk through this rapidly. The way I would prefer that we do this is I will give you a quick background on it. And to me, the fun part and the real learning part for me and everybody in the room are the questions and answers. So I look forward to people thinking about what we're doing and coming up with thoughts and questions and ideas.